My name is Lula, and I'm 53 years old. I raised my son Jacob as a single mother after his father walked out when he was just 2. For 25 years, I sacrificed everything to give that boy the best life I could manage. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and never dated because Jacob was my world. Last night, after his mother in law's birthday party, my son looked me straight in the eye and said the most devastating words I've ever heard. I wish Diana had raised me instead of you. Those words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces right there in my own living room. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit that like button. Trust me, you won't believe how those cruel words changed everything by morning, and how my son learned the hardest lesson of his life. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like when Jacob was growing up. When his father Mark disappeared one Tuesday morning, taking nothing but his clothes and leaving behind a 2-year-old boy and a mountain of debt, I had two choices. I could crumble or I could fight. I chose to fight with everything I had. I dropped out of community college where I was studying to become a nurse. Instead, I took on 2 jobs to keep us afloat. During the day, I waited tables at Murphy's Diner downtown, serving coffee and pancakes to construction workers and office clerks. The tips weren't much, but every dollar counted. At night, after putting Jacob to bed, I'd head to the office building on 5th Street where I cleaned floors until 3 in the morning. I'd come home exhausted, grab maybe 4 hours of sleep, then wake up to make Jacob breakfast before starting the whole cycle over again. Those years were brutal, but watching Jacob grow into a smart, kind young man made every sacrifice worth it. He was my pride and joy. He never got into trouble, always did his homework without being asked, and even started doing small chores around the house when he turned 8. When he got that full scholarship to State University, I cried for 3 days straight. I had done it. I had raised a good man all by myself. Jacob met Sarah during his junior year, and they got married 2 years ago in a small ceremony that I somehow managed to pay for by working extra shifts for 6 months. Sarah seemed like a sweet girl, though I noticed she came from a completely different world than ours. Her mother, Diana, was a retired corporate lawyer who lived in a mansion on the hill, the kind of house I used to clean when I was desperate for extra work. Diana was everything I wasn't. Sophisticated, well-educated, wealthy, and polished. She had raised 3 successful children while maintaining her career, something she never let anyone forget. When we first met, she looked me up and down like she was appraising a piece of furniture at a garage sale. Her smile was perfectly practiced, but her eyes were cold as January. The contrast between us was impossible to ignore. Where I offered homemade cookies, Diana served imported chocolates. Where I gave heartfelt advice, Diana provided connections and opportunities. I tried my best to fit in during family gatherings, but I always felt like I was playing a game where nobody had bothered to explain the rules to me. Still, I bit my tongue and smiled because Jacob seemed happy. Sarah was good to him, and if this was the life he wanted, I would support it. Even when Diana's comments about different upbringings and making the best of what we have cut deep. I swallowed my pride. My son's happiness mattered more than my wounded feelings. Yesterday was Sarah's 26th birthday, and Diana insisted on hosting the party at her house. I should have known it would be a disaster from the moment I pulled up in my 15-year-old Honda next to the row of luxury cars in her circular driveway. The house looked like something from a magazine, all white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. I had spent weeks knitting Sarah a beautiful lavender scarf, working on it every evening after my shift at the diner. It wasn't much, but it was made with love and careful attention to every stitch. When I handed it to her, Sarah's smile was genuine and warm. "Oh, Lula, this is gorgeous. You made this yourself." Then Diana presented her gift. Diamond earrings that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Sarah gasped and immediately put them on, and I watched my handmade scarf get set aside on the gift table like an afterthought. During dinner, Diana held court at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories about her children's accomplishments and her own successful career. But then she started with the what-if scenarios that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "You know, Jacob," she said, cutting into her perfectly prepared salmon, "if you had grown up in this house, you would have learned French from our au pair. And piano, of course. I made sure all my children understood the importance of classical music and proper cultural education." Jacob laughed and nodded. "That would have been amazing. I always wished I could speak another language. Oh, and the etiquette lessons." Diana continued, warming to her theme. Proper table manners, how to network at social functions, the art of meaningful conversation. These things matter so much in professional settings. Sarah chimed in. Mom always says presentation is everything in life. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as Diana's gaze landed on me with that patronizing smile I had come to dread. Of course, we all do our best with what we have. Not everyone has the same resources. The word resources hung in the air like a slap. I wanted to remind her that my resources had been love, sacrifice, and determination, that I had given Jacob everything I had, even when it meant going without myself. But Jacob was nodding along with everything Diana said, and I realized with growing horror that he was agreeing with her assessment. When I tried to contribute to the conversation by mentioning Jacob's academic achievements and his scholarship, Diana waved her hand dismissively. Well, yes, but imagine what he could have accomplished with proper guidance from the beginning. The right schools, the right connections, the right opportunities. The final blow came when Diana started talking about discipline and structure. I always believed in high expectations. My children knew that mediocrity wasn't acceptable. They had to earn everything they received. I couldn't help myself. The words came out before I could stop them. Jacob never needed to earn my love. He always had it unconditionally. Diana's laugh was like broken glass. Oh, Lula, love is wonderful, but it doesn't prepare children for the real world. Sometimes kindness can be a disservice. That's when Jacob spoke up, but not to defend me. Instead, he looked at Diana with something like admiration and said, You're absolutely right. Structure and expectations are so important. I felt like I was drowning in my own dining room chair. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of strength I possessed, was essentially agreeing that my way of raising him had been inadequate. The ride home was silent, except for the sound of my heart breaking. Back in my small apartment, I tried to start a conversation about the party, hoping maybe Jacob would acknowledge how uncomfortable Diana's comments had made me feel. Instead, he seemed irritated that I was bringing it up at all. Mom, you're being too sensitive, he said, loosening his tie and settling onto my worn couch. Diana wasn't trying to hurt your feelings. She was just being honest about the advantages she could have provided. I stared at my son, this man I had shaped and molded with my own 2 hands, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. Jacob, do you realize what she was saying? She was basically telling me I failed as a mother. He sighed heavily, the same way his father used to when he thought I was being unreasonable. That's not what she meant, and you know it. She's just pointing out that different circumstances lead to different outcomes. Different circumstances? My voice was rising now, 25 years of suppressed frustration finally bubbling to the surface. I gave you everything I had. I worked myself to the bone to make sure you had food, clothes, books, everything you needed. I know you did, Jacob said, but his tone was impatient rather than grateful. But maybe that's the problem. You sacrificed too much, and now you expect gratitude for choices I never asked you to make. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down hard on the chair across from him, feeling dizzy. You never asked me to make those choices, Jacob. You were 2 years old. You couldn't ask for anything except for someone to love you and take care of you. That's not what I meant, he said, running his hands through his hair. I just think, look at Diana. She raised 3 successful kids and still managed to have her own career, her own identity. She didn't lose herself in motherhood. I didn't lose myself, I whispered, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. I found myself. I found my purpose. Jacob stood up and started pacing, his frustration evident in every step. But don't you see, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You made me your entire purpose, your whole identity. That's a lot of pressure to put on a kid. Pressure? I could barely get the word out. Loving you was pressure. No, but making me responsible for your happiness was. The words came out sharp and cruel, and I saw him wince immediately after saying them. But he didn't stop. Diana raised successful, independent children without making them feel guilty for having their own lives. Guilty! I stood up too, my voice shaking with hurt and anger. When have I ever made you feel guilty for anything I celebrated, every achievement supported, every decision loved you unconditionally, no matter what? Maybe unconditional love isn't always the best thing, Jacob shot back. Maybe some conditions, some expectations, some structure would have been better. Maybe I would have been more successful, more confident, more prepared for the real world. The room went dead silent. We stared at each other across the small living room where I had read him bedtime stories, helped him with homework, and bandaged his scraped knees. This room where I had poured out my heart and soul for 2 decades, and where my son was now telling me it hadn't been enough. Then he said the words that changed everything. Sometimes I wonder what my life would be like if Diana had raised me instead of you. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out my heart with their bare hands. Jacob's face immediately registered shock at his own words, and I saw him take a step toward me. "Mom, I didn't mean—" But I was already walking toward my bedroom. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't hear his voice. 25 years of sacrifice, love, and devotion had just been dismissed as inadequate, unwanted, and inferior to what a woman who barely knew him could have provided. I closed my bedroom door and sank onto my bed, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. Even when Mark left, I had Jacob. Now I felt like I had lost them both. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, Jacob's words echoing in my head like a broken record. By the time dawn crept through my bedroom window, something inside me had fundamentally shifted. The hurt was still there, deep and raw, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like steel. I got up, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. If my son wanted to know what life would have been like with Diana as his mother, then I was going to give him exactly what he wished for. I picked up my phone and dialed Diana's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and professional, even at 7:30 in the morning. "Diana, this is Lula. I have a proposition for you." There was a pause. "Lula, is everything all right?" This is rather early for a social call. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Last night, Jacob said he wondered what his life would be like if you had raised him instead of me. I think we should find out." Another longer pause. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." I took a deep breath. "Jacob clearly believes you would have been a better mother than I was. You've certainly made it clear that you think your methods are superior to mine. So here's my proposal. Jacob is going to come live with you for the next month. Not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as your son. Your responsibility. Let's see how well your theories work in practice." "Lula, that's absurd. I can't possibly—" "Why not?" I interrupted. "You've spent the last 2 years telling me all the things you would have done differently, all the advantages you could have provided, all the ways you would have shaped him into a better person. Here's your chance to prove it." I could hear Diana's mind working through the phone. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "Are you serious about this?" "Dead serious. Jacob wants to know what life would have been like with you as his mother. I'm giving him that opportunity. 1 month, your house, your rules, your expectations. You handle everything. His meals, his schedule, his problems, his needs, everything." "And Jacob agrees to this. Let's find out." I hung up and immediately called Jacob's cell phone. He answered on the first ring, his voice heavy with sleep and what might have been regret. "Mom." "Jacob, I've been thinking about what you said last night. You're right. You deserve to know what your life would have been like if Diana had raised you." "Mom, about last night, I was upset and I said things." "No, sweetheart, you were honest, and honesty deserves an honest response. I just called Diana. You're going to spend the next month living with her. Not visiting, living, as her son." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought the call had been dropped. Finally, Jacob spoke. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said. You move into Diana's house today. She becomes responsible for you in every way a mother is responsible for her adult child. You follow her rules, meet her expectations, live by her standards. You wanted to know what life would have been like with her as your mother. Now you'll find out." "Mom, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Diana is expecting you this afternoon." Another pause. "And what about you?" I looked around my small apartment at the photos of Jacob covering every surface at the secondhand furniture I had carefully chosen to make our house a home. "I'll be here when you're ready to come back, if you ever are." When Jacob arrived an hour later, his face was a mixture of confusion, defiance, and what might have been the first stirrings of concern. Sarah was with him, looking worried and uncertain. "Lula, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. It seems like maybe everyone just needs to cool down and talk things through. I hugged her gently. Sometimes talking isn't enough, honey. Sometimes people need to experience the consequences of their words. I had already packed a bag for Jacob with some of his clothes and personal items. As I handed it to him, I pulled out my wallet and gave him $50. This should cover your expenses for today. Diana will handle everything else from now on. Jacob took the money and the bag, but his earlier confidence seemed to be wavering. Mom, maybe we should call me when you realize what you've lost, I said quietly and closed the door behind him. I watched from my window as he got into Sarah's car. Just before they pulled away, I saw him look back at the house, but I didn't wave. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. The first 3 days were the hardest for me, but apparently not for Jacob. Sarah texted me updates, and social media told the rest of the story. Jacob was posting photos of Diana's gorgeous house, the gourmet meals, the luxury of having someone else handle all the domestic responsibilities. But Diana, true to her word, wasn't treating Jacob like a guest. She was treating him like her son, which meant her rules applied from day one. My house operates on a schedule, she told him on his first morning. Breakfast is at 7 sharp, no sleeping and no exceptions. If you're going to live here, you'll live by the standards I set for all my children. Jacob's first wake-up call at 6 a.m. was apparently a shock. He'd been used to sleeping until 9 or 10 on weekends at his apartment, but Diana made it clear that weekends didn't exist in her household. Every day had purpose, structure, and expectations. By day 3, Jacob was required to contribute to the household in ways he'd never experienced. Diana assigned him daily chores that had to be completed to her exacting standards. When his bed wasn't made with hospital corners, she made him do it over. When he left dishes in the sink, she explained that in her house, cleaning up after yourself wasn't optional, it was basic respect. I don't run a hotel, she informed him, when he commented that his mother had always handled the housework. Adults are responsible for their own messes and their share of communal spaces. Meanwhile, I was discovering something unexpected. For the first time in 25 years, my time was entirely my own. I could eat dinner at 9 p.m. if I wanted to. I could read a book without interruption. I could take a bath without worrying about anyone else's schedule. I signed up for the painting class at the community center that I'd been meaning to take for years. I bought myself flowers just because I liked them. I called my sister in Oregon and we talked for 3 hours without me once checking the clock or worrying about getting dinner started. When neighbors asked where Jacob was, I simply said, "He's living his dream now." I didn't elaborate, and something in my tone discouraged further questions. Sarah called me every day, growing more concerned as the week progressed. "Jacob seems stressed," she told me. "Diana is very demanding." "How so?" I asked, though I was starting to get a picture. "Well, she has all these rules and expectations. Jacob has to account for every hour of his day. She's treating him like he's still a teenager." "Isn't that what he wanted, a mother with structure and high expectations?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I think he thought it would be different." By the second week, the cracks were really starting to show. Jacob's car broke down on Tuesday, and when he asked Diana if he could borrow one of her cars, she looked at him like he'd asked to borrow the crown jewels. "Earn it," she said simply. "I didn't hand my children anything they hadn't worked for. If you need transportation, get a job and save for repairs." So Jacob found himself taking the bus to his part-time job at the marketing firm, something he hadn't done since college. Diana also informed him that since he was an adult living in her house, he needed to contribute financially to the household expenses. "I'm not running a charity," she explained. "Room and board cost money, food costs money, utilities cost money. My own children paid their share when they lived at home as adults." Jacob's savings, which he'd been carefully building toward a down payment on a house, started draining faster than he'd anticipated. Diana's idea of contributing was more substantial than he'd expected, and her standards for everything from groceries to household supplies were significantly more expensive than what he was used to. But it was the emotional distance that seemed to affect him most. Diana didn't ask about his day with warm curiosity the way I always had. She didn't remember that he liked his coffee with just a splash of cream or that he had a deadline coming up at work that was making him nervous. When Sarah visited on Friday night, she found Jacob looking thin and tired. Diana had instituted a fitness routine that included a mandatory 6 a.m. run and evening gym session. Physical discipline leads to mental discipline, she explained when Sarah questioned the rigorous schedule. But Jacob's never been much of an athlete, Sarah protested. Exactly, Diana replied. That's the kind of low expectation that doesn't serve anyone. My children learn to push through discomfort to achieve goals. Sarah texted me after that visit. Lula, I'm worried. Diana is treating Jacob like he's some kind of project that needs fixing. She keeps talking about all the things you did wrong and how she's going to correct years of poor habits. I read her message sitting in my garden where I'd been painting watercolors of the flowers I'd planted. The evening was peaceful, and for the first time in years, I wasn't worrying about anyone but myself. I texted back, Jacob wanted to know what life would have been like with Diana as his mother. How's that working out for him? But inside, despite my determination to let Jacob learn this lesson fully, my heart was starting to ache. Not for the man who had dismissed my sacrifices, but for the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he had a bad dream. The boy who would bring me dandelions from the yard like they were roses. Diana called me that Sunday evening, her voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. Lula, I think we need to talk about this arrangement. Is there a problem? A long pause. Jacob is challenging. He's not adapting to structure the way I expected. He seems to resist every boundary I set. I almost smiled. Is that so? He's also rather needy, emotionally, I mean. He seems to expect a level of validation and support that, frankly, I find exhausting. Imagine that, I said dryly. I'm beginning to think that perhaps your approach had some merit after all, but I wasn't ready to let either of them off the hook yet. Give it time, Diana. Good parenting takes patience. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Week 3 brought the crisis I'd been expecting. Jacob came down with a nasty flu on Wednesday, the kind that leaves you weak and miserable and desperate for comfort. When I was raising him, sick days meant homemade soup, gentle back rubs, and me checking on him every few hours. Diana's response was markedly different. She left a bottle of over-the-counter flu medicine on his nightstand, along with a note, "Medicine is in the bathroom cabinet. I have a charity board meeting this evening. Try to keep your germs contained to your room." Jacob spent that day alone in Diana's pristine guest room, shivering under covers that smelled like fabric softener instead of home. There was no one to bring him extra blankets or to check if he was staying hydrated. No one to sit with him when the fever made him feel scared and small. By Thursday, when Diana returned from her meeting to find Jacob worse instead of better, she was clearly annoyed rather than concerned. "You need to see a doctor if you're not improving," she said from the doorway, making no move to enter the room. "I can't have illness spreading through the house, and frankly, this is disrupting my entire schedule." That's when Jacob finally understood the difference between being cared for and being managed. Friday evening, as Jacob lay in bed feeling worse than he had in years, he did something he hadn't done in 3 weeks. He called me. The phone rang 4 times before I answered, and when I did, my voice was calm and measured. "Hello, Jacob." "Mom." His voice was hoarse and broken, and I could tell immediately that he was sick. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to drop everything and go to him. But I stayed in my chair. "How's your new life going, sweetheart?" There was a long silence filled only with his labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was small and defeated. "Mom, I made a terrible mistake." "What kind of mistake?" I was wrong about everything, about you, about Diana, about what I thought I wanted." I closed my eyes and gripped the phone tighter. "What happened to change your mind?" "I'm sick and I'm alone and Diana acts like I'm an inconvenience. When you used to take care of me when I was sick, I never realized. I never appreciated." His voice broke completely then, and I heard him crying. My baby boy, 26 years old, and finally understanding the difference between conditional and unconditional love. "I know, honey," I said softly, "but some lessons you have to learn the hard way. Can I come home, Mom? Please." "What does Diana think about all this?" She overheard me talking to you just now. She said maybe I should call my mother because this arrangement isn't working out. And what do you think? I think I've been the world's biggest fool. I think I threw away the most precious thing I had because I was stupid and ungrateful and— "Jacob," I interrupted gently, "come home." Within an hour, Jacob was at my door with his bag, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red from crying. Diana hadn't even said goodbye. She'd simply watched from her window as he loaded his car with the few belongings he'd taken to her house. The moment I opened my door and saw him standing there looking lost and broken and sorry, every wall I'd built around my heart crumbled. He was still my baby, and he was hurting. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered as I pulled him into my arms. "I'm so, so sorry." "I know you are, sweetheart. I know." We spent the next 2 hours on my couch, Jacob, with his head on my lap like he used to do when he was small, both of us crying and talking and healing. I made him the chicken soup I'd been making for him since he was a child and watched him eat it like he hadn't seen food in weeks. "Diana had everything," he said quietly, "but she had no warmth, no real love. Everything with her was conditional, earned, measured. You gave me love just because I existed." "That's what mothers do," I said, stroking his hair. "No," he said, looking up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had a month ago. "That's what you do. That's what makes you special. I was so stupid to think that having more money or fancier things could replace what you gave me." "You weren't stupid, honey. You were human. Sometimes we have to lose something to really understand its value." He sat up and took my hands in his. "Mom, can you ever forgive me for what I said, for what I put you through?" I studied his face, seeing the man I'd raised, but also recognizing something new there. Humility, gratitude, a deeper understanding of what love really means. "There's nothing to forgive," I said. "You needed to learn something important, and now you have. But I was so cruel. Those things I said about your sacrifices, about unconditional love being wrong. Jacob, these last 3 weeks taught me something too. I raised you to be independent, to question things, to think for yourself. Even when those thoughts led you away from me temporarily. That's not failure. That's success." He shook his head. "Diana kept saying I was spoiled, that you'd made me weak by loving me too much. And what do you think now?" "I think love is what made me strong enough to admit when I was wrong. I think love is what gives you the courage to apologize and try to make things right. Diana's children might be successful, but they call her twice a year and visit on major holidays. They have respect for her, but no real affection." I nodded. Different approaches create different relationships. "I don't want a relationship built on conditions and achievements," he said firmly. "I want what we have, what we've always had, which is real love, messy, imperfect, unconditional love that doesn't keep score or demand payment." Sarah came over later that evening, and the three of us had dinner together around my small kitchen table. She kept looking between Jacob and me like she couldn't believe the change in him. "You look different," she told him. "I feel different," he admitted, like I understand something I didn't before. "What's that?" Jacob looked at me across the table, and his eyes were full of a gratitude that went soul deep. "I understand the difference between being raised and being shaped. Diana tried to shape me into what she thought I should be. Mom raised me to become who I was meant to be." After Sarah left, Jacob and I sat on my small balcony, looking out at the city lights. The silence between us was comfortable now, full of understanding and renewed connection. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to know that every sacrifice you made, every choice you made to put me first, every time you went without so I could have something, none of that was wasted. It all mattered. It all made me who I am." "I know, sweetheart. And I need you to know that I'll never take it for granted again. What you gave me, what you did for me, it was everything. It was more than enough. It was perfect." I reached over and took his hand. "You don't need to carry guilt about this, Jacob. The fact that you can recognize love and appreciate it now means I did my job right. Your job, my job, was to raise a man who understood the value of genuine love, who could recognize it and cherish it and eventually give it to others. You learned that lesson. Maybe not the easy way, but you learned it." We sat quietly for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jacob spoke again. "Diana called me this afternoon before I came home. She said she wanted to apologize." "Really?" "She said she'd never realized how hard it was to love someone unconditionally, that everything she did was about achievement and performance, but she'd never learned how to just be present for someone. That's quite an admission. She also said she finally understood why her own children keep their distance. She raised them to be successful, but she never taught them that they were lovable, just as they were. I felt a pang of sympathy for Diana. That's sad. I told her it was never too late to change, but she said old habits die hard. She's 72 years old and just now realizing that love isn't a reward for good behavior. Some people learn that lesson early, some learn it late, and some never learn it at all, I said. At least she's learning. Jacob squeezed my hand. I'm grateful I learned it when I did, and I'm grateful for the mother who taught it to me. As we sat there in the peaceful evening air, I reflected on the journey we'd both been on. 3 weeks ago, my heart had been shattered by my son's thoughtless words. Tonight, it was fuller than it had ever been. Love isn't about having all the right resources or providing perfect opportunities. Love isn't about money or status or impressive achievements. Love is about showing up day after day, year after year, with open arms and an open heart. It's about believing in someone, even when they don't believe in themselves. It's about creating a safe place where someone can be imperfect and still be cherished. I had given Jacob the greatest gift any parent can give their child. Not success or wealth or status, but the absolute certainty that he was worthy of love just exactly as he was. Diana, for all her advantages and achievements, had never learned how to give that gift to her own children. And now Jacob understood the difference. He understood what he'd almost thrown away and why what we had was worth more than all the mansions and diamond earrings in the world. I love you, Mom, he said as we finally headed inside. I love you too, sweetheart. Always have, always will. Even when I'm being an ungrateful fool. I smiled and kissed his forehead. Especially then. That night, as I listened to Jacob moving around in his old room, unpacking his things and settling back into the home he'd taken for granted, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in weeks. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some truths can only be understood through loss. Jacob had learned both, and in doing so had gained something far more valuable than anything Diana's money could have bought him. He had gained a deep, unshakable understanding of what real love looks like and why it's worth more than all the conditional approval in the world. Tomorrow, we would start fresh, not as the mother who had sacrificed everything and the son who had taken it for granted, but as two people who understood the precious gift they'd been given in each other. And that understanding would make our love stronger than it had ever been before. The last thing I heard before falling asleep was Jacob's voice muffled through the wall, but clear enough to understand. Thank you, Mom, for everything. And in that moment, I knew that every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment of worry and love and hope had been worth it. Because I had raised not just a successful man, but a grateful one. Not just someone who could achieve great things, but someone who could recognize and appreciate the love that had made those achievements possible. That's the real measure of successful parenting. Not what your child accomplishes, but what they understand about love, gratitude, and the precious gift of being unconditionally cherished by another human being. Have you ever had to teach someone a hard lesson about appreciation? Have you experienced the pain of having your sacrifices dismissed, only to have someone later realize what they'd taken for granted? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please, like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe for more real-life stories that matter, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes we all need a reminder about the difference between conditional and unconditional love, and why the people who love us without conditions are the most precious gifts we'll ever receive. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you always recognize and cherish the love in your own life before it's too late.